What's on your guys' mind? What's the interesting thing you were going to say, Adam?
Well, I was curious what Geoff thought about this, because I think for a split moment in time recently, I think the right wing had a real opportunity to, by default, if they wanted to seize the moment, they could actually be the political apparatus that was going to uphold classical liberal norms, such as freedom of expression, debate, and that they could have actually they could have literally shifted the paradigm in a way that really, like, the right would become the backer of art in American culture at this moment in time, at least given what's possible in present political economy. Now, that being said, I have found to a degree that the right-wing publications that ask me to write for them have a very set window of ideological acceptability, not to the extent that left-wing magazines do, where it's like the criteria is massive and you have to almost like hit every single point on the criteria. But the right wing, especially the stuff that I write about, where I have passages about jerking off and prostitution and drugs, etc., definitely can't get away with everything, which is fine because I've built a platform that's big enough that I don't really need to use other outlets anymore. But it is nice to broaden your audience, and it is just something like a roadblock that I've been coming across at this point. And I was curious what Geoff, if you've had any kind of similar experience, or you think that that's correct.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in that. I'm also, asked to write for sort of more right-wing publications. I think because I don't write about the arts in the way that you do, Adam, my experience is probably different. And, I'd say overall it's quite different in that I'd say in terms of what kinds of, my basic take on this is something like the following. I think at this point you have a number of young editors at sort of more conservative publications who are elite educated, were exposed to a wide range of stuff through their education, and they're kind of aware that the right-wing intellectual tradition that's dominated the sort of American conservative world for the past couple generations is extremely limiting and is extremely impoverished. And, that basically you have this generation of conservatives that are brought up on sort of, like at the lower end, sort of Ayn Rand, and at the higher end, Russell Kirk or somebody like that. And
yeah,
I don't really know Russell Kirk's work. I don't, so I'm not necessarily dunking on him, but, I think there is a kind of opening to, first of all, because, and this is sort of related to what I've written about, because the left itself has, if in effect, if not in name, sort of relinquished a lot of its sort of supposed theoretical commitments to certain thinkers and their contributions, that they've, in my language, some of these thinkers have become kind of orphaned, right? And so then there's sort of an opening for, again, I think these quite astute, sort of usually younger editors at these conservative publications to kind of figure out how they can increase the range of ideas that they're engaging with and using to make sense of the weird shit that's been going on.
Definitely.
So I think there's that opening. I'd say the example that maybe overlaps with your with your comments is that, probably like my biggest article of the past year in terms of like how many people have read it is the one for American Affairs on Foucault, right?
Yeah.
And so one thing that's extremely interesting to see is how split the right is on this, because they are I mean, I think the more astute among them are giving Foucault and related thinkers a second look right now. And then there is also a huge sort of coalition of them who are extremely committed to the idea that, you know, Foucault is a pedophile and therefore is evil and can never be engaged with, right?
Right.
And so, and then, you know, so on one hand you have that, right? So, you know, these figures who are just kind of anathematized and sort of associated with all kinds of taboos. And then on the other hand, you have the kind of influence of, you know, the sort of James Lindsay sort of anti-critical race theory sort of movement, which is, you know, extremely sort of, I mean, its entire account of sort of 20th century of 20th century intellectual history is a kind of, you know, embarrassing joke. I mean, and so to the extent that those kind of people have influence, I think they're really pushing against this other tendency to, you know, kind of expand the range of ideas and thinkers that are being entertained and particularly brought into the discussion about what's going on. Because I think you do have this this other move towards just this kind of, I mean, I would say kind of aggressive ignorance is how I'd characterize people like Lindsay, right? They're just kind of, you know, they're basically interested purely in doing propaganda and not really in understanding anything. So
you know what? That's one thing I want to talk about was this crazy thing that I've been noticing, and of course, Geoff, you wrote this whole article about theory cells in Trump world, I think is the name of the article, and it's basically about how all these people on the right are like getting into like fucking Heidegger and like or like people thought of as like on the left, you know, in the 60s, like French intellectual thinkers like Derrida and shit like that. But you know, one thing I've also been seeing is like the Gramscian right, like Antonio Gramsci, who I'm really into. He's being really picked up and read by the right. Antonio Gramsci?
He's picked up by the right these days.
Hell yeah, dude. You don't know about the Gramscian right? Geoff, tell him about the fucking Gramscian.
I had no
right
fucking
shit.
idea.
You know, there's also this guy that fucks with Dugin. I really know about this from...
Well, Dugin makes a lot more sense to me than Gramsci. I mean, Gramsci's like as bougie communist as it gets.
I know, right?
Yeah.
He's really like, yeah, like he's usually been, you would think of him as like on the left or whatever. As like
he's
this
totally bourgeois communist.
Well, dude, like, fucking, so look, Geoff, fucking in that article, you said, you know, like, who was it that, you know, Breitbart, that said, culture is, or politics is downstream from culture, right? And that is a Gramscian idea.
Right. Yeah, so I think, I mean, okay, so you have this sort of, I think the sort of modern popularization of Gramscian thought on the left is, I mean, I associate it with like Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Laclau and that book about what is solidarity, contingency, hegemony, is that what it's called?
Yeah.
And so, you know, there is a kind of, I mean, the interesting thing I see is that there is this kind of direct line where, I mean, you know, that whole argument was sort of complex, but you know, it roughly outlines a sort of strategy of the left that, you know, still exists to some extent, although, you know, largely to the benefit of its continued affiliation with, you know, sort of major corporate neoliberal blob parties like the Democrats here and Labour in UK. But, you know, that basically argued that you had to, you know, adopt this range of kind of cultural strategies that you couldn't simply rely on, you know, sort of labor organizing, and instead you had to, you know, basically
shift the cultural hegemony.
Shift the cultural hegemony through, you know, creating these kind of alliances between different. So I mean, that's, you know, basically pretty standard stuff at this point, but it did come out of this kind of rediscovery of Gramsci as I understand it. And then what you get, I think, is this kind of way that the right itself embraces some version of this. And, you know, I think it's like, there's always a kind of difficulty between prescription and description. Like, I think part of the point of that would be you don't really need that theory to do a strategy like this. In some sense, a lot of it just comes about to the extent that the theory is adequately describing something that's happening, right? And so I think, what you do though find with like Breitbart and the founding of Breitbart is this kind of explicit embrace of and arguably the right has always kind of relied on various kinds of, quote unquote cultural strategies. I mean, that's, if you go back to like the function of the religious right and all of that stuff, which of course failed dramatically in the by the first Obama term, right? The whole cultural strategy of the right, which had been defined by basically abortion and opposition to gay marriage and things like that. I mean, it was all, at least as a strategy for sort of cultural hegemony, had disastrously failed, right? And so what you get with somebody like Breitbart is an attempt to figure out different cultural strategies, right? And then that coalesces around the kind of, basically the sort of the various things that Bannon, who's Breitbart's collaborator, attempted to do, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I think there is this kind of semi-overt Gramscianism that comes out of Breitbart, and that I think Bannon, regardless of how well versed he is in Gramsci, I'd guess not really that much, is at least apprised of a version of. And so then, yeah, you get this kind of, you get this kind of parallelism where, and, I would say like, actually, this is sort of what Kill All Normies is about too, right?
Yeah, totally.
That you have this kind of parallelism where you have these two kind of cultural strategies that are sort of chafing against each other.
Dude, Richard
coalesce
Spencer
in the sort of online culture wars of, that kind of crested like 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah.
No, Richard Spencer wrote like his like college, like he wrote something in college, like on Gramsci or something. I think he like studied Gramsci in college. He's a Gramsci scholar.
He's
isn't
a
he?
fucking Fed is what he is.
Oh no,
he's
totally.
Totally
FBI.
But this is really interesting to me, actually, because I mean, Gramsci's theory in retrospect is almost discredited. Like, it turns out that if you are just trying to capture, I mean, because the left captured the cultural hegemony, they absolutely fucking won. Their values are at the center of the mainstream establishment. And I'll say this with the addendum, historical non-voter, but at this moment in time, when I see basic liberal values under assault that took hundreds of years of armed conflict to secure, whether it's speech, expression, due process, when these are all under assault by a left-wing establishment, I'm going to vote Republican basically every fucking election at this point. I don't even get, it's not even like, I'm just not going to even think about it. I'm just going to start checking off R's like indiscriminately. But that said, if I do have one major critique of the right at this moment in time is they still seem, not everybody, of course, but there is still this thing where the right seems to think that they can control the superstructure without shifting political economy or offering a new vision of politics and economics. And with that, like you have, God, I kind of lost my train of thought right now.
Can I bring in an example that might be relevant?
Absolutely.
I mean, I didn't honestly follow or pay that much attention to any of it, but, this whole Virginia governor election is kind of a good example that, I mean, it was clearly a kind of pretty wide range of things that led to it, but, the extent to which the narrative was that, the real winning ticket is to fight critical race theory in schools. I mean, that's another thing that I've been thinking about a lot, and I have a piece coming out about this sometime soon, is the whole state of exception concept. And what's interesting is the way that sort of identifying and responding to kind of state of exception politics on the opponent's side is kind of often seems to become the means by which you sort of engage in your own state of exception politics. And so, I think the sort of the idea that, this is just kind of trying to flesh out what I think you were pointing at, Adam, but like, the idea that of a politics, largely, at least in messaging terms, oriented around this idea of this like crisis in the schools that you have to return to, colorblind educational praxis. I mean, it's a very, it's an extremely shallow analysis, right? Which nevertheless has great propagandistic power.
Right.
And so, but it's not rooted in anything deeper than the idea that there's this immediate crisis that you have to undo, right? And I think that does not point to anything particularly, I mean, however you feel about the actual proposal of, or, how real is it? I mean, I don't know, however you feel about the actual proposal, like the fact that it becomes the headline issue is revealing of how shallow the analysis is.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'd say as far as like COVID politics, and I don't really have an opinion as to how big of a factor that actually was in how people voted in Virginia. I will say what seems significant is that everybody was, that it was taken to be that. Like it doesn't really matter if that's what people actually thought. It was the message that was extracted from it, and everybody was patting Chris Rufo on the back, right? And so that was kind of a successful contestation of hegemony, right? Totally. Even if it didn't go very deep in terms of how it prompted people to vote, it still just radically shifted the narrative.
Right.
But I think that also points to the shallowness of this kind of politics of shifting hegemony, right? Because it doesn't really ultimately go much beyond sort of temporarily shifting the terms of a narrative or sort of reversing the terms of a narrative.
And and that reminds me of what I wanted to say, because I think absolutely people are justifiably very worried about there being like an enforced racial paranoia in like children's schools. So it's an easy fucking issue to really kind of exploit and get some fucking votes out of, because even at face, the idea that like, oh, let's start teaching kids that, there's these innate divisions that, have just been there for hundreds of years, and they have to just learn to be like conscious and paranoid about it constantly. But like, I don't know. Fuck, I keep forgetting what the fuck I was going to say. Holy shit, I'm a mess today. But it's like I just see the right wing, right? Like they have a real opportunity right now, because the burnout from left liberal hegemony and rule is like exceedingly real. And you take something like COVID. I mean, that's such a winning issue there. I have tons of friends who can't get fucking jobs anymore just because they don't want to take a vaccine that they don't need or whatever. I do feel like there's this like limitations that always just kinds of happens in politics that are sort of, for one thing, sort of backed by niche interest groups. And I find that a lot in the media sphere too. All these companies have backing with their own kind of interests. But I mean, but like, I think like the central contradiction is like, if the right wing wants to win, and I think they do, and I think that they have like, as far as like, actual existing politics are concerned, they have like a serious claim to want to oppose what's going on right now. But But like, so sorry, can you cut this? I'm kind of like forgetting what I'm saying right now.
No, yeah. Also, yeah, I can jump in real quick because I had some other shit to say.
I just had one thing to say, but it keeps like slipping my fucking mind.
Well, yeah, just whenever you think of it, just fucking
Yeah,
just say
go
what's
ahead.
up.
I'll
But
think of it.
okay. Well, yeah, no, I had two things. Okay, one thing we'll get to. I want to get out. I want to get out of the way because I've been curious, and I know that Geoff, you're a Foucault fucking guy, right? So, you know, and so I liked Foucault. He was one of the first people I really got into reading. And then you later learn about the fucking, just what you said earlier, like the pedophile shit. What is up with, why do people think Foucault is a pedophile? What is up with this whole French philosopher shit of them being pedophiles or whatever? What is up with that?
Yeah. Well, I think, okay, so you certainly had this this significant debate, or I suppose it was a kind of debate. I'm not a huge expert in it, but there were a number of like open letters that were published in the 60s and 70s having to do with age of consent laws, right? And
Right.
a large number of sort of prominent French intellectuals, including Foucault, signed these letters, right? And so, I think within that period there was a kind of sense that this was part of the sexual revolution. You can find people in the U.S. like, Allen Ginsberg, off the top of my head,
yeah,
who's also into this kind of stuff.
He was
there was exactly. So
NAMBLA.
there was a kind of there was a period in which it was not uncommon to have this as sort of a view that this would come out of the sort of the politics of sexual liberation. So, on one hand, you have that Foucault was not particularly of an outlier among the French intellectuals of that period. You can look at those letters; they were signed by just about everybody.
Everyone, Deleuze, Guattari, fucking everybody.
Yeah. So I think there's that. I don't know, that's, and then as far as his own activities, whatever. I don't think in that period in particular, in the sort of gay subculture of Europe, the idea that you'd be particularly worried about whether someone was above or under 18 was very common.
Yeah.
It just wasn't really that big of a deal.
100%.
The specific claim, and so the specific claim of him being a sort of literal pedophile as opposed to, having liaisons with teenagers, perhaps, which, again, would not have been uncommon in any of the gay subcultures in which he was involved, both in Europe and the US in that period. But, the specific thing that came up earlier this year was, essentially claiming that he was sort of having sex with like actual young boys in Tunisia when he was had a teaching post in Tunisia for a couple of years in the late 60s. So, this is an unverified claim by a guy who does happen to be a sort of ideological, who I guess at a certain point was sort of a friend or acquaintance, and who spent time with him when he visited Tunisia, another French intellectual, but who is definitely a sort of conservative, a sort of cultural conservative, and ideological opponent of Foucault. So it's not a particularly the story that made the I'm not going to say it's not true. I don't know, but it's not. It's just one person's word, and that person happens to have been a sort of ideological opponent. So it just doesn't seem particularly, I don't know, significant or revelatory of an allegation.
Totally.
Yeah.
But whatever, I'm not, but also like on some level, I don't actually care that much.
Yeah.
But
exactly, because you can still engage with the content of the work.
Yeah.
Without
no matter what.
taking in every fucking biographical tendency
Exactly.
or trait. But I don't think my personal opinion was that Foucault was not a pedophile in that because he was attracted to men. right? Like most of his lovers were men. He was a gay man. But at the time, I think it was kind of just like a libertine affectation of gay culture, especially gay intellectual culture. I mean, Burroughs fucked a lot of teenage boys in Tangier. Foucault did his thing. At least, you know, because these things kind of change, like according to historical context and the way they thought of it. It wasn't the same that we're like internalizing this now. Like they would have thought it was like this sort of perverse, debonair, aristocratic affectation, not necessarily like a really fucking dark, heinous like sex crime, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's just like a different kind of mentality.
I was watching this William S. Burroughs documentary, and one of the people that they were interviewing was his like young boyfriend or whatever. And
yeah, the one he was with when he died, the last one, yeah.
And fucking, you know, they're talking about like it was just a normal thing, you know, like it totally wasn't a big deal. I'm not sure how old he was or if he was underage specifically, but
he was 18 when they met.
Oh, okay, well then that should be fine. You know what I mean? Yeah, fucking, you know. But Allen Ginsberg, that guy really, you know, was on the fucking like NAMBLA shit or whatever I think it's called. You know, like I still see people talk about Allen Ginsberg today, you know, and talk about how great his writing is and how much they like him. Like,
well, he's a very serious poet. I mean,
yeah.
I don't
you know,
personally like his work, but there's no fucking doubt that he made history when he wrote Howl and all that.
Yeah.
He was part of a major moment in American literary history. The Beats, whether you like them or not, is a much historicized moment in our culture.
So,
like 50s.
I mean, so trying to kind of draw a larger implication from all of this. I mean, I'd say on one level, you know, again, this, I think, you know, I mean, and I saw this because like, I think my piece on Foucault came out not that much longer after that, you know, allegation was made about Tunisia. And I sort of saw the whole cycle of responses to it. You know, I think there's this kind of, and, you know, this is sort of a criticism of the right, you know, is that it gravitates obviously towards, you know, anything that's kind of useful as propaganda fodder against the left. And, you know, one of the points it really wants to make is, or one of the assertions it wants to make is this kind of, oh, they're pedophiles, they're perverts, degenerates, etc.
Yeah,
and
they're
so,
evil, like
so if they can
yeah.
kind of enlist
Pedophile.
in that, you know, in that it's very useful to them. But, you know, I think it's sort of short-sighted or limited in some ways. I mean, you know, again, I'm not sort of a orthodox Foucauldian or anything like that. I don't, you know, I think there are like aspects of his thought that I'm sort of less influenced by than others. But, you know, he, you know, his whole body of work is a kind of interrogation of like the limits of freedom, right? Yeah. And so, you know, so in that sense, we can think about the question of like the age of consent in terms of the sort of intellectual tools that he gives us, right? Because he's somebody who's thinking historically about how these sorts of norms and standards and sort of moral frameworks come into existence and what, you know, what functions they perform, right? And so, you know, I think one of the main weaknesses of this kind of desire to, you know, and I saw it again with this, like, I personally wasn't very, you know, I saw people I might otherwise agree with on a lot of things. Like, you know, there was something about this, some academic who's like written a book about quote unquote minor attracted people or something like that. I mean, I'm, you know, that, yeah. I, you know, so there are, of course, again, just a whole cycle of sort of dunking on, not only dunking on this, but sort of, you know, actually trying to get this person canceled in effect, like on the right. So, but, you know, I think part of what's bad about this whole like, oh, they're just degenerates and want to fuck children sort of like meme, which you can understand the appeal of and why they want to kind of make this type of argument, is that, you know, it's much more, it's
Pizzagate shit and everything.
Right. But yeah, exactly. But it's much more complex than that because, you literally the other thing we've seen in the past few years, I mean, yes, so there may be actual, queer left academics who are writing books about, why we need to normalize minor attracted people or whatever. But at the same time, this is also, a period in which, this sort of insanely puritanical regime of consent has been brought into place, in which, ideas about this sort of age gap discourse, I mean, not just sort of age of consent, but just the idea that, if there's any like age difference greater than a couple of years between two people, then they like literally can't consent to have sex with each other. So, I mean, what's bizarre is that if you just focus on the, oh, they're pedophiles kind of side of things, what you're not noticing is that they are also in the process of attempting to, and I'd say in particularly in like university campuses, succeeding in setting up these unbelievably onerous and invasive new norms that point in essentially the opposite direction, where almost where in fact the point is not to relax taboos, but to make essentially almost any sexual interaction potentially taboo.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, what's bizarre is the way that both of those things are happening at once, right?
Yeah.
That yes, you can see on one hand this supposed kind of libertine relaxation, but at the same time, you see the opposite tendency taking hold in the exact same circles, right? And so the people who are making the cheap shots at Foucault or whoever, just so that they can peddle this sort of like, oh, they're degenerates meme, are not taking into account the fact that like from these same circles, what we're seeing is the emergence of this, unbelievably invasive and sort of dictatorial regime of control regarding sexuality, right? And so, and that's a sense in which their sort of enthusiastic ignorance about anything Foucault had to say is hobbling them from actually, using any of his insights to try to understand what the fuck is going on there.
Right. And honestly, I probably do I have grown quite hard line on some of my positions, at least in terms of my politics. Like, I do think that the influence of NAMBLA is kind of like all over the politics of Antifa in certain sectors of the academic left in terms of problematizing childhood. But I really despise like the Wignats and the alt-right types just as much as I kind of do the dirtbag left. And I really kind of see them in this dialogue that together creates a force of repression. Like, they really do kind of need each other, which is why right now, like, I believe if the right wing was going to make a case for, this is going to sound so boring, but if the right wing was just going to make a generalized case for freedom, at least the idea of freedom that was won by French aristocrats in the 19th century, that is life, liberty, property, etc., like protecting due process, protecting just being fucking normal, just like, to be fucking normal, like, is a really great case right now, because everything is so chaotic that we've become used to chaos and crisis as our day-to-day state of affairs. And for sure, the left has, I mean, like, think of the contradiction here. On one hand, you have Noah Berlotsky or whatever,
that guy sucks,
advocating for minor attracted people research. At the same time, they have people like acting like horny DMs and shit are this like huge criminal problem that needs to be litigated in the public eye, which is just like shit that everybody does because everybody is imperfect. Like, the right can win, I think, if they just get back to this like bougie actual liberalism That's what they need to do right now, is to be really the last liberals, because liberals at this moment have collapsed upon all their contradictions. This is not liberalism. Liberalism would not be treating Kyle Rittenhouse, would not be cheering on an innocent young man going to jail for 30 to life just because it's convenient to their political narrative. Liberals would say, let's step back and give this kid due process.
Yeah.
That's the shit you need to do right now if you want to win. Give me a second. Go ahead, guys. I got to answer the door.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was also thinking about that. There's shit with the sacrifice. Like, Geoff, you wrote some shit about, like, sacrifice and cancel culture.
Yeah,
I think this fucking Kyle Rittenhouse shit is totally fucking,
it's very
like,
interesting.
Totally has to do with this, like, sacrifice, cancel culture
there's this
shit.
need
Totally,
to create, to sort of manufacture these figures who can be the objects of sort of collective hatred, right? And so he clearly kind of ended up being positioned in that way, and so the thought experiment I found interesting was, like, speaking of pedophiles, actually, but, like, this other Rosenbaum guy, right?
Yeah, totally.
It was such a bizarre character because he just kind of turned up out of nowhere. He really was a kind of homo soccer type figure. Like, he's like a complete social outcast and pariah, Rosenbaum, right? And he just kind of drifts into this situation. And, everybody was talking about, like, oh, Rittenhouse shouldn't have been there. Well, the guy who in some sense really shouldn't have been there was Rosenbaum, right? Because he was really just this kind of complete loose cannon, just kind of floating around looking to, seemingly mix it up with somebody. And, So it's interesting that he actually was in some ways the more, I'm interested in the way that, this sort of contagion of violence. And so in some sense, he was actually the better suited figure for that role, right? Because he was kind of this, quite monstrous figure who was also completely abject. And, you could imagine him just kind of becoming himself a kind of object of collective hatred. And yet instead, he actually managed to kind of, in some sense, deflect the violence away from himself towards Rittenhouse, and thereby kind of transfer that status to Rittenhouse, right? And so, I saw the stuff about angry white man or something, and, like, there's not many pictures of Rittenhouse where, if any, where he actually looks angry, right? He always looks kind of goofy and, like, way out of his depth, kind of sweet, right? So, whereas if you look at, whereas if you look at Rosenbaum, he kind of looks like this figure of, like, he's even like a sad, right? So what's
he
really
looks
weird
autistic, to my opinion.
Yeah. So anyway, I just, the whole situation is so weird because, it seems like with Rittenhouse in particular, it's clear you have somebody who, there are all these other figures who are kind of made to serve this particular function, right, in the discourse, right, which is kind of this sort of sacrificial figure who, is usually kind of abject in some way, and who's, who sort of fits all of these requirements, right? Who can be the sort of object of collective hate. And, in various ways, he was such a poor candidate for it. Yet they sort of still managed to force him into that role.
100.
Yeah, totally.
The whole thing was incredibly red pilling. Like,
oh, dude, yeah, how they framed that shit in the media, man, because I wasn't really paying attention to it.
It really
holy shit.
It really does prove that these motherfuckers can spin
anything. Dude.
And not only will people just take what they say at face value, one of my good friends, a great painter who I red pilled the fuck out of this year, but he just texted me this morning and he's like, I didn't even know that Rittenhouse's quote unquote victims were white until like 2 days ago. And not that that even matters. Like, anybody who watches that video in good faith, it is incredibly clear that he had a serious self-defense case. I mean, you could even possibly make the case that if he hadn't opened fire, he'd be dead, period. Or at least grievously fucking injured. And B, not only, I mean, the kid's kind of downright impressive. Like, he didn't even fucking open his firearm until the exact moment that it was, like, absolutely clear that he was in serious danger.
Totally.
And, you know, like,
he's a good shot too.
Yeah, and I don't even want to, like, I mean, I know there's like this huge tendency to like have this debate about whether he's heroic or not. I don't even think that's the point.
Hero worship is kind of stupid.
I mean, I get it. Like,
I get it too, because
like,
they're so pissed off at how these people are trying to frame him. I get it, but
yeah, and you see this like young kid under threat from the most powerful people in the world, all lying and assassinating his character. I think from his perspective, he probably went there with what he considers to be noble intentions. Sure, you can call it naive, but that's not illegal. I think the whole thing was really, honestly, truly fucking depressing. I really do. Like, I mean, this is why I'm so glad I've been like consistent in my politics. Like, I believe in due process. I always fucking have. And I think why the debate about this got so heated and why a lot of the two sides stuff, or both sidesism, was a little offensive, is that the case did have massive implications. Because what they were really trying to do was to equate the fact that he was both a Trump supporter and a gun enthusiast with murderous intent. Because they charged him with murder in the first degree, which means they were trying to make the case that he showed up to kill people vigilante style. There was absolutely no proof that that was the case. There are literally fucking videos of the kid not just treating counter-protesters, but giving first aid to the Antifa Looney Tunes while he was there. So really, this was about criminalizing antagonistic political beliefs, criminalizing the fact that he's a gun enthusiast, whatever. And I will say, it's great that the jury did the right fucking thing, because I was really worried. Like, I mean, I really
thought it was going to set a
precedent,
precedent, like for shit to come.
Absolutely. Like, yeah, totally. I really thought that the jury would be like open and shut once they saw the video, and then once they heard all the testimonies, like this is whatever your opinions of the case are, the facts on the ground are the kid was in serious danger and he opened fire, and his gun was legal, and they had to drop the fucking gun charge before they even deliberated. And it did like restore some faith in the fact that maybe the justice system still does stand outside the totalizing forces of the media. But think of like really how sick these people are, that they would be okay with a young man spending 30 years in prison because it flattered their politics. It's really kind of sick and evil. And I don't know, the whole thing kind of hurt to watch.
Yeah, I didn't really give a fuck until I seen the Matt Orloff video that he put together, where he put together all the different camera angles and shit, and then talked about all the different places that the media, different media publications, and how they were framing it. And when I really watched that video, sometimes you needed something like that to really put it all together for you, because I just wasn't really paying attention to it. And then I watched that video, and then I was like, holy shit. yeah, I seen it on the Jimmy Dore show. And I was like, holy shit, this is actually crazier than I thought. This is actually maybe worth thinking about and talking about. And just how insane the media is with twisting these stories, and fucking the goddamn media, like, liberal apparatus, and how it fucking it's like it didn't even need to necessarily lie to anybody. The apparatus, it's such a powerful force that like everyone's saying, like, they just thought the whole time that these people were black that he killed. You know what I mean? Like, that's just how powerful the apparatus is.
I mean, so two things. One, I haven't really, I've thought about trying to dive into see what I could find on the more conspiratorial end, but like, I find Rosenbaum like the most sort of fascinating, bizarre figure in all of this, because he's not a protester. He's just this kind of, again, like totally abject sort of social pariah who's like done completely monstrous things in his life, is clearly just like a complete like social refuse kind of figure, right? But it's almost as if he had if he had been essentially a kind of MK Ultra type,
dude,
just kind of let him loose in there. I mean, if it would have been, let's just put it this way, like, if that had happened, then the effects might have ended up being pretty similar, right? Because if you just wanted to let loose this kind of vector of violence into this volatile situation and just see what happens, and realize that whatever happened, the major media organs could kind of spin it in such a way, if he ended up attacking some BLM protesters, he could be a skinhead neo-Nazi. If he ended up getting shot, he could be a innocent, I mean, as he ended up being an innocent, sort of good-hearted protester out there. I mean, even like last week, I saw him described as a protester in the New York Times, right? I mean, this is still how people describe it. So, he's such a weird figure, like wild card in this whole story, because he does seem to be the one, according to all the video evidence, who kind of turns it, right?
Yeah, totally.
I'm not sure there is this other couple as well who have some kind of weird, who are also this kind of lumpen, heavy criminal record kind of people, who he seems to be kind of have some kind of association with in some of the video footage, and who also at some point, at a crucial point, like one of them fires a gun in the air, right? So, I mean, because I read a lot of conspiracy stuff, I was like, man, if you wanted to identify sort of, these MK Ultra type people, right, who have sort of been in and out of prison and psychiatric institutions.
Yeah, dude.
And then just imagine, like, oh, he just happened to be turned loose on the street. Like, I'm not saying that this is true. I'm just saying, like, the story is so perfect. Like,
what do you guys?
What happens to have been turned loose on the streets on the day of the stuff?
Yeah, dude.
And like,
what's your guys' possibility that you think this is a psyop?
For the full episode, go to Drug Cult Gang Patreon. The link is in the description.
Upside down, crossing the jumbotron, wait up. Hold on, blowing and direct off my pump, say what? You're wrong. Switch stance, face plan, they pump all your starters. Flatlander, plug puller, no Dr. Billings charter. You speaking abbreviations because real life conversation moves too slow. You're the media's creation, yeah, your free will has been taken and you don't know. Fuck yourself, choke yourself. Culture sharp, just talk, fuck yourself, choke yourself. Culture sharp, just talk, fuck yourself, choke yourself. Never seen without 100, she's a satanic priestess. Anarchy on light, spit flat, fly faceless, see leaders. Throwing her down low and rapping Orion with suicidal bodies.